a proud father, struggling to keep the lights on, suddenly exposed by the innocent words of his hungry child. But then, a customer, with a broken tire, returned, carrying a secret no one expected. She didn't just need her car fixed. She owned a chain of food banks. Hope spreads fast, but so does resistance. Powerful forces will try to shut it down, and one night, flames will tear everything apart. In a town divided, can one father's fight for dignity and one boy's question rebuild not just a garage, but an entire community? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn wind whistled through the gaps in the old garage's weathered doors as Ethan Cole wiped his grease-stained hands on a shop rag. The day's last rays of sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. His bones ached from hours bent over engines, but there was still one more important task before he could rest: feeding his son. Ethan glanced at the clock mounted above his workbench. 6:45 p.m. The face was so covered in grime that he could barely make out the numbers, but he knew the routine by heart. He'd kept the same schedule since Sarah passed 3 years ago, marking time by the habits that helped him and Micah survive. "Time for dinner, buddy," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty bay. 9-year-old Micah looked up from his homework, spread across a makeshift desk fashioned from an old oil drum and a piece of plywood. His pencil paused mid-equation. "Can I help, Dad?" "Sure thing, sport." Ethan's weathered face softened as Micah carefully arranged his math papers into a neat stack. The boy had his mother's careful way of doing things, always precise, always thoughtful. Together they walked to the small break room tucked behind the office. The space was tight but clean, with a mini fridge, microwave, and a hot plate that had seen better days. Ethan reached for the large pot he'd brought from home that morning, his movements careful to hide how light it felt. "Want to get the bowls?" he asked Micah, who nodded eagerly. While his son pulled their familiar chipped bowls from the cabinet, Ethan stirred the soup. The vegetables floated sparse and lonely in the broth he'd stretched with extra water. Again. His stomach clenched, but he forced a smile as he ladled a generous portion into Micah's bowl, leaving less for himself. "Smells good," Micah said, though they both knew it wasn't true. He climbed onto one of the metal folding chairs, his feet swinging above the linoleum floor. Ethan watched his son blow carefully on each spoonful, just like Sarah had taught him. The boy's dark hair needed a trim, falling into eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. Ethan's throat tightened. There should be more than this. More food, more security, more everything, for his boy. "How was school today?" Ethan asked, trying to distract himself from counting the floating carrots in his own bowl. "We learned about the water cycle," Micah replied between careful bites. "Did you know that the same water that's here now could have been drunk by dinosaurs?" "Is that right?" Ethan managed a genuine smile at his son's enthusiasm. "Yeah. And Miss Thompson says—" Micah's voice faltered as his spoon scraped the bottom of his bowl. He stared at the empty ceramic for a moment before looking up. "Dad, could I have some more?" Ethan was already reaching for the pot before Micah finished asking. "Of course." But as he lifted the lid, his heart sank. There was barely enough for half a bowl left. Still, he scraped every last bit into Micah's bowl, ignoring his own hunger. "Thanks, Dad." Micah's voice was soft, heavy with a knowledge no child should have to carry. They finished their meal in silence, the only sound, the tick of the clock, and the occasional scrape of spoons against ceramic. Outside, the last of the daylight faded, leaving them in the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. Ethan's mind wandered to the stack of bills in his office drawer. The garage had been quiet lately, too quiet. People were stretching their repairs further, choosing what they could live with rather than fix. He understood. He was doing the same with their groceries. "Ready to head home?" he asked, standing to wash their bowls in the small sink. "Can I finish my math first? I'm almost done." 10 minutes, Ethan agreed, knowing how important good grades were to his son. While Micah returned to his homework, Ethan began his closing routine. He checked the locks on the bay doors, straightened his tools, and reviewed tomorrow's appointment book. 3 oil changes and a brake check, not enough to make a dent in what they needed. The next morning arrived crisp and clear. Ethan had been at the garage since dawn, trying to get ahead on work before customers arrived. The waiting area slowly filled with the regular morning crowd. Mrs. Henderson with her temperamental Buick, Mr. Patterson arguing with his insurance company on his cell phone, and a new face, a well-dressed woman who'd called about a flat tire. Micah sat in his usual spot, a worn chair in the corner, his backpack at his feet. He would wait there until the school bus passed by at 7:45. It was their morning routine, as familiar as the smell of motor oil and coffee that perpetually filled the garage. The office radio hummed quietly, playing old country songs between weather reports. Ethan was reviewing Mrs. Henderson's invoice when Micah's voice cut through the mundane morning sounds. It wasn't loud, but somehow it filled the entire room. "Dad, why don't we have food?" The radio seemed to fade away. Mrs. Henderson's pen stopped mid-signature. Mr. Patterson's insurance call went quiet. The well-dressed woman looked up from her magazine. Every adult in the room froze, their attention drawn to the small boy in the corner and his devastating question. Ethan stood behind the counter, his hands gripping the edge, unable to move or speak as the silence stretched out around them. The morning sun cast long shadows through the garage's windows as Ethan worked on Mrs. Henderson's brake pads. The familiar scent of motor oil and rubber hung in the air, while Micah sat quietly in the corner of the waiting area, his small legs dangling from an oversized chair as he worked on his math homework. A metallic groan caught their attention as an expensive silver SUV limped into the parking lot, its front passenger tire completely flat. The vehicle came to a stop at an awkward angle, and out stepped a well-dressed woman in her mid-50s. Despite her elegant appearance, she carried herself with a humble demeanor. "Hello?" she called out, peering into the garage. "I'm hoping someone can help me with a flat." Ethan emerged from under Mrs. Henderson's car, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Yes, ma'am. I can take a look at that for you." "I'm Grace Alvarez," she said, extending her hand. "I hit something on Main Street, and now I'm running late for a meeting." Ethan nodded, his weathered face showing genuine concern. "Let's get you back on the road quickly then. I'm Ethan Cole, and that's my boy Micah over there." He gestured toward his son, who gave a shy wave without looking up from his homework. Grace smiled warmly at Micah before turning back to Ethan. "How long do you think it'll take? If it's just a simple flat, shouldn't be more than 30 minutes. Ethan walked over to inspect the tire. "Yep, looks like you caught a nail. Good news is the tire can be patched." While Ethan worked, Grace settled into the waiting area near Micah. She noticed the boy's careful concentration on his math problems and the worn edges of his backpack. The office showed signs of age, water stains on the ceiling tiles, a coffee maker that had seen better days, and a small collection of well-thumbed magazines. "That's some impressive multiplication you're doing there," Grace commented to Micah, who brightened at her interest. "Thanks. Dad helps me practice my times tables while he works on cars sometimes." Outside, the sounds of Ethan's work filled the air. The whir of the jack lifting the SUV, the metallic clang of tools, and the hiss of pressurized air. He moved with practiced efficiency, his movements precise despite the early hour. 25 minutes later, Ethan lowered the SUV back to the ground. "All set, Mrs. Alvarez." I patched the tire and checked the pressure in all four. "You should be good to go." Grace reached for her purse. "What do I owe you?" Ethan glanced at his rate sheet, then at Micah, before quoting a price well below his usual fee. $25 for the patch and labor. Grace's eyebrows rose. "That seems very low. Surely it should be more." "No, ma'am. 25 is fair." Ethan's voice was firm but kind, his pride evident in his straight posture despite his worn work clothes. Grace pulled out two $50 bills. "Please, I insist on paying your regular rate, at least." Ethan shook his head, gently pushing back one of the bills. 25 is what we agreed on. We don't change prices once they're set." His voice carried a quiet dignity that made further argument impossible. Grace studied him for a moment, noting the slight shadows under his eyes and the careful way he handled the money. She tucked the rejected bill back into her wallet, respecting his decision even if she didn't agree with it. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. You've saved my morning." She smiled warmly at both father and son. "The service here is excellent. I'll be sure to remember that." As Grace drove away, her silver SUV now running smooth and level, she watched through her rear-view mirror as Ethan turned toward his son. The morning's earlier moment hung heavy in the air. Micah's innocent question about food still echoing in the quiet garage. Ethan walked over to Micah and wrapped him in a tight hug, his weathered hands gentle against his son's small back. His face showed a mix of love and embarrassment, but mostly determination. Looking up at the ceiling, his lips moved in a silent prayer of gratitude for the day's remaining appointments, each one a small blessing in these lean times. "Let's get back to work, buddy," he said softly, running a calloused hand over Micah's hair. "We've got Mrs. Henderson's brakes to finish, and Mr. Thompson's timing belt after that." Micah nodded against his father's chest, his small fingers gripping the worn fabric of Ethan's work shirt. The morning sun continued its climb, casting warm light through the garage windows, illuminating the pair in their quiet moment of connection. The evening air carried the sweet scent of fresh cornbread as Ethan and Micah sat at their small kitchen table. Mrs. Peterson from next door had appeared an hour ago, with the still warm bread wrapped in a checkered cloth, claiming she'd made too much. Ethan knew better. She'd seen Micah's worn backpack and hollow cheeks. Their kitchen was modest but clean, with faded yellow curtains that Ethan's late wife had sewn years ago. A single light bulb cast a warm glow over the scratched wooden table where they sat. Micah's homework lay pushed to one side, his pencil forgotten as he broke off another piece of cornbread. "Slow down, buddy," Ethan said softly, watching his son savor each bite. His own piece sat untouched. The shame of accepting charity, even from a kind neighbor, sat heavy in his stomach. He was a Marine veteran. For heaven's sake, he should be able to provide for his own child. "Can we say grace, Dad?" Micah asked, crumbs dotting his chin. "Mrs. Peterson always says we should thank God for our food." Ethan's throat tightened. "Sure, son. Go ahead." Micah folded his small hands and closed his eyes tight. "Dear God, thank you for Mrs. Peterson's cornbread. It's really good." He paused, then added in a clear, innocent voice that pierced Ethan's heart, "And please help us have more food for tomorrow. Amen." The simple prayer echoed in the quiet kitchen. Ethan blinked hard, his calloused hands gripping the edge of the table. 9 years old, and his boy was praying for basic necessities. The thought made his chest ache. "Dad?" Micah's voice pulled him back. "You didn't eat your piece. Just thinking, buddy." Ethan forced a smile and took a bite. The cornbread was indeed delicious, but each mouthful felt like swallowing his pride. Later that night, after tucking Micah into bed with an extra blanket against the chill, Ethan sat at his desk reviewing bills by lamplight. The stack of unpaid invoices seemed to mock him. Business had been slow since the new auto shop opened across town, with its flashy signs and credit payment plans. His simple garage, passed down from his father, couldn't compete with their modern equipment. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of empty cupboards and his son's questioning eyes. Morning arrived with a crisp brightness that belied Ethan's heavy thoughts. He opened the garage early, hoping to catch some brake jobs or oil changes before the morning rush headed to work. Micah sat at his usual spot in the waiting area, nose buried in a library book about cars. The familiar rumble of an expensive sedan caught his attention. Through the open bay door, Ethan recognized the silver car from yesterday, the one with the flat tire. Grace Alvarez stepped out, looking determined in a neat business suit that spoke of success. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," she said warmly, her voice carrying across the concrete floor. "I wonder if we might talk." Ethan wiped his hands on a shop rag, noting that all 4 tires looked perfectly fine. "Everything okay with the repair, ma'am?" "The tire's perfect," she smiled, glancing at Micah, who had looked up from his book. "I'm here about something else. Is there somewhere we could chat?" Ethan led her to his small office, its walls covered in faded car posters and certification documents. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, remaining standing himself. "I want to be direct, Mr. Cole," Grace began, placing her handbag in her lap. "I'm the founder of Neighbors Table. We're a network of food banks across 3 states. Ethan's spine stiffened. Had someone reported them to social services? Ma'am, if this is about— Please, she held up a hand, her expression gentle. I'm not here to interfere. I'm here to propose a partnership. She reached into her bag and pulled out a glossy folder. Neighbor's Table has been looking to pilot a mobile food pantry program. We need a strategic location. Someone with mechanical knowledge who can maintain our delivery vans, and most importantly, she paused, meeting his eyes, someone who understands both pride and need. Ethan's hands clenched behind his back. I appreciate the offer, but we're managing fine. Grace's eyes flickered to the waiting area where Micah sat. Your son's question yesterday about not having food, it reminded me of my own childhood. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept help, Mr. Cole. Not just for ourselves, but for others who might be too afraid to ask. She opened the folder, revealing photos of modern food banks and smiling volunteers. We'd like to base our mobile unit here, at your garage. You'd be paid to maintain our vehicles and manage local distribution logistics. It's not charity, it's a business proposition. Your skills, our resources. Grace sat across from Ethan at his worn desk in the garage office, her hands folded neatly on its scratched surface. The morning sun streamed through the dusty window, catching the determined glint in her eyes. Mr. Cole, I've been thinking about your garage since yesterday, she said. This location would be perfect for what we need, a mobile food pantry distribution point. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his weathered hands clasped together. The memory of Micah's innocent question about food still burned in his ears. Ma'am, I appreciate the thought, but, please, call me Grace, she interrupted gently. And before you say no, hear me out. Neighbor's Table has been looking to expand our reach. We need places where people already gather naturally, places they trust. Ethan glanced through the office window at his garage bay. Tools hung in careful order on the walls, and the concrete floor bore the honest stains of decades of hard work. Pride and uncertainty warred in his chest. People do come here, he admitted slowly. Been fixing their cars for 15 years now. Grace nodded eagerly. Exactly. And you've built something valuable, trust. That's harder to earn than any business license. She pulled out a folder and spread some papers on the desk. Photographs showed other Neighbors' Table locations, clean, well-organized spaces with volunteers helping families choose fresh produce and staples. We'd handle all the food sourcing and most of the logistics, Grace explained. We just need space to set up temporary distribution points, maybe twice a week. The rest of the time, it's business as usual for you. Ethan rubbed his chin, studying the photos. And what's the catch? No catch. We're a legitimate nonprofit. Everything's above board. Grace's expression softened. Though I suspect you're really asking what it would cost you. Yes, ma'am, Grace. Ethan corrected himself. I've learned there's usually a price for help. The space would be rented fairly. We'd cover any additional utilities and insurance. She leaned forward slightly. But I think what you're really worried about is pride, isn't it? Ethan's jaw tightened. The Marine Corps had taught him to be self-sufficient, to never show weakness. But Micah's face floated in his mind, innocent, trusting, hungry. Maybe, he admitted quietly. Grace's voice was gentle but firm. There's no shame in building something bigger than yourself, Mr. Cole. In fact, it takes more courage than going it alone. Ethan stood up and walked to the window, watching as Micah played with a toy car in the waiting area. His son looked up and waved, smiling that pure smile that always melted his defenses. I'd need to work for it, Ethan said finally, turning back to Grace. Not charity, real work. Grace's eyes lit up. Actually, we desperately need someone with mechanical skills. Our delivery vans need regular maintenance, and coordinating their routes is a logistics puzzle. That I can do, Ethan nodded, feeling some tension ease from his shoulders. Been keeping cars running and schedules straight since my service days. Perfect. Grace pulled out another document. We could start with a trial period, see how it goes. Ethan read through the agreement carefully, his mechanic's eyes catching every detail. It was fair, professional, a real business arrangement, not a handout. When would you want to start? We could begin setup tomorrow, Grace said, trying to contain her excitement. I've got volunteers ready to help arrange the space. We could do our first distribution by the end of the week." Ethan took a deep breath, then extended his hand. "All right. Let's give it a try." The next morning brought a flurry of activity to Cole's garage. Volunteers streamed in carrying folding tables, signs, and boxes of supplies. Ethan directed traffic with the precision of a drill sergeant, ensuring the setup didn't interfere with his regular repair work. "These tables need to be mobile," he instructed 2 young volunteers. "We'll need to clear the space for vehicles most days." Grace moved through the organized chaos with clipboard in hand, checking off items and answering questions. She paused to watch Ethan showing a volunteer how to properly secure a shelf to the wall. "You're good at this," she observed. "Just treating it like any other job," Ethan replied, but there was less gruffness in his voice than yesterday. In the corner, Micah sat surrounded by crayons and paper, his tongue stuck out in concentration. He'd been working on something since breakfast, refusing to show anyone until it was perfect. Finally, he stood up, clutching his creation. "Dad, Miss Grace, it's ready!" Everyone paused as Micah proudly held up a large piece of poster board. In careful child's writing, decorated with colorful drawings of cars and food, were the words, "We fix cars, fill carts." "Can we hang it up?" Micah asked, bouncing on his toes. "Please?" Ethan lifted his son onto his shoulders, letting him tape the sign above the entrance to the bay. The volunteers broke into spontaneous applause, making Micah beam with pride. "Perfect spot, buddy," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "Right where everyone can see it." The morning continued with volunteers arranging tables, setting up a check-in station, and organizing the space for efficient flow. Ethan found himself drawn into conversations about traffic patterns and storage solutions, his practical experience proving invaluable. "We'll need better lighting over here," he noted, pointing to a shadowy corner, "and maybe some non-slip mats for when it rains." Grace made notes, nodding appreciatively. "This is exactly why we needed someone who really knows the space." As the setup neared completion, Ethan watched Micah carefully placing paper signs on each table, marking where different types of food would go. His son's small acts of help, so earnest and hopeful, made something shift in Ethan's chest. Maybe Grace was right. Maybe there was strength in building something bigger than himself. He looked around at his transformed garage, still his workplace. But now, something more. Something that might help other families avoid the quiet desperation he'd been facing. Under Micah's colorful sign, volunteers continued their work, preparing the space for its new purpose. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, Ethan allowed himself to feel a cautious hope. They weren't just fixing cars anymore, they were fixing something bigger. The bell above May's diner door chimed as Ethan entered, scanning the morning crowd until he spotted Grace at a corner booth. She'd insisted on buying him breakfast to discuss the details of their partnership. The familiar scent of coffee and bacon wrapped around him as he made his way through the bustling restaurant. "Morning," he said, sliding into the vinyl seat across from her. A cup of black coffee already waited for him. "I ordered you the special," Grace said with a warm smile. "May says you're partial to her biscuits and gravy." Ethan nodded, wrapping his calloused hands around the warm mug. "Been coming here 20 years. May's never steered me wrong." The morning sun filtered through the diner's wide windows, catching the silver threads in Grace's dark hair. She stirred her tea thoughtfully, her expression growing more serious. "Before we get into the logistics of the pantry," she said quietly, "there's something you should know about why I started Neighbor's Table." May arrived with their plates, biscuits drowning in pepper gravy for Ethan, and wheat toast with eggs for Grace. She waited until May had moved away before continuing. "My father owned Alvarez Grocery on Oak Street for 30 years, Grace said, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Back in the 70s, it was the biggest store in town." Ethan paused mid-bite, recognition crossing his face. "I remember that place. Closed down maybe 15 years ago?" Grace nodded. "My father." She took a deep breath. "He wasn't always a kind man. There was a time when he refused service to Latino families in our community. Said they were driving away his regular customers." The pain in her voice was old but still sharp. Ethan set down his fork, studying her face. The busy diner seemed to fade away as Grace continued. I was 12 when I first saw him turn away the Martinez family. Mrs. Martinez had walked 3 miles with her children to buy groceries. The shame on her face. Grace's voice caught. I'll never forget it. She straightened her shoulders, meeting Ethan's gaze. That night, I took food from our own kitchen and rode my bike to their house. It wasn't much, just cans of soup and some bread. But Mrs. Martinez hugged me like I'd given her gold. The morning light caught the moisture in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. When I inherited the store after my father passed, I couldn't keep it. The walls held too much hurt, but I knew I had to do something to make it right. So you started Neighbor's Table? Ethan said softly. Yes. Sold the store, used the money to open our first food bank. Grace's smile returned, gentle but determined. Every location we open, every family we help, it's another step toward healing that old wrong. We serve everyone. No questions asked. No judgment given. Ethan pushed his half-finished plate aside, his throat tight. The parallel to his own situation, the soup he'd watered down, Micah's innocent question hung unspoken between them. Miss Alvarez, he started, his voice rough, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want pity. I can take care of my own. Grace reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of touching his. This isn't pity, Mr. Cole, she answered softly. It's purpose. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the garage's open bay doors as Ethan worked under the hood of Mrs. Henderson's Buick. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking belts and hoses, while Micah sat nearby on an overturned milk crate, homework spread across a clean workbench. Hand me that socket wrench, buddy? Ethan asked, reaching out without looking. Micah placed the tool in his father's waiting hand. Is Miss Grace coming back today? Not until tomorrow. We've got to finish setting up the sharp click of dress shoes on concrete cut him off. Dale Whitaker's tall figure appeared in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark finger. The councilman's gray suit looked out of place among the oil stains and tool cabinets. Cole, Dale said, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of a politician. Got a minute? Ethan straightened, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Mr. Whitaker, what brings you by? Dale's eyes swept across the garage, lingering on the folding tables stacked against one wall and the newly painted We Fix Cars Fill Carts sign. His lip curled slightly. Official business, I'm afraid. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. Notice of zoning violation. This property is designated B2 Commercial Auto Service. Your recent activities. Fall outside. Permitted use. Ethan's jaw tightened as he took the envelope. Activities? Food distribution requires different permits, different insurance. Dale adjusted his tie. Can't have just anyone handing out groceries. There are health codes, safety regulations. We have permits, Ethan said quietly, conscious of Micah watching. Neighbor's Table handled all the paperwork. Ah, yes, the chain from the city. Dale's smile didn't reach his eyes. But you see, this isn't the city. Maple Hollow has its own ordinances, and speaking as your landlord, I have concerns about liability. Liability? Ethan's voice grew sharp. For feeding people? For changing the character of the neighborhood. Dale glanced meaningfully at the parking lot. Different crowds bring different problems. I'm sure you understand. Heat rose in Ethan's chest. He recognized the implied threat in Dale's words, the same prejudice that had driven Grace's father to turn away customers years ago. The hearing's set for next week, Dale continued. Planning and Zoning Board, though given your month-to-month lease situation. He left the sentence hanging. Micah slipped off his crate and moved closer to his father. Ethan felt his son's small hand slip into his. That all, Mr. Whitaker? Ethan asked evenly. For now. Dale turned to leave, then paused. You know, Cole, you've been a good tenant. Quiet, reliable. Be ashamed to jeopardize that over some misguided charity project. The councilman's footsteps echoed as he left, each click of his heels like a hammer striking metal. Ethan stood motionless, the notice crumpled slightly in his fist. Dad? Micah's voice was small. Are they going to make us stop helping people? Ethan squeezed his son's hand. "No, buddy, they're gonna try. But we're not giving up that easy." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of oil changes and tire rotations. Ethan worked mechanically, his mind churning over Dale's threats and the precarious position he'd put himself in. The notice sat on his desk, like a ticking bomb. As evening approached, Micah curled up in his usual spot, a clean pile of shop rags in the corner where he often napped while Ethan finished late jobs. The boy's breathing soon grew steady and deep. Ethan moved through the familiar routine of closing up, rolling down the bay doors, shutting off the lifts, counting the day's modest earnings. Finally, he stood in the darkness of his office, holding the violation notice up to the faint light from the street lamp outside. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. Everything he'd built, everything he'd scraped together for Micah, balanced on the whim of men like Dale Whitaker. Men who saw feeding the hungry as a threat to their comfortable order. In the corner, Micah shifted in his sleep, moonlight touching his peaceful face. Ethan watched his son and felt the weight of the choice before him. Back down and protect what little they had, or stand firm and risk losing it all. The crumpled notice felt heavy in his hands as the night pressed in around him. The fight wasn't just about zoning codes anymore. It was about the kind of world he wanted his son to inherit. One where fear could silence compassion, or one where courage could change hearts. The evening air hung heavy with summer heat as Ethan's old pickup truck rattled down Cedar Lane. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. Dale Whitaker's zoning notice crumpled in his jacket pocket. The truck's headlights cut through the growing dusk, illuminating Reverend Price's modest white house with its weathered porch swing and carefully tended flower beds. Ethan had dropped Micah at Ruth Ann's for dinner, promising to return soon. Now, sitting in his idling truck, he wrestled with his pride. The last thing he wanted was to burden others with his troubles. But Reverend Price had always been different. A steady presence since Ethan's return from overseas. Never pushing, just there. The porch light flickered on before Ethan could even knock. Reverend Price opened the door, his lined face creasing into a warm smile. At 74, he moved slower than he used to, but his eyes remained sharp and kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I had a feeling I'd be seeing you tonight," Reverend Price said, gesturing toward the porch swing. "Come sit a spell." Ethan followed, easing onto the wooden swing that creaked in familiar protest. The evening crickets filled the silence as Reverend Price settled beside him, both men looking out at the darkening street. "Dale Whitaker came by the garage today," Ethan finally said, pulling out the crumpled notice. "Says we're violating zoning codes with the food pantry." Reverend Price took the paper, studying it in the dim porch light. He hummed, the sound neither surprised nor discouraged. "Some folks get mighty uncomfortable when things start changing. I can't fight City Hall, Reverend. I've got Micah to think about, and the garage lease is month to month. Dale could—" "Let me tell you a story," Reverend Price interrupted gently, folding the notice and setting it aside. "Back in '68, I was just a boy, not much older than your Micah. My daddy lost his job at the mill, and times got real lean. Mama heard about a church giving out food boxes on the other side of town." He paused, rocking the swing slightly. "We walked 3 miles in August heat, me and Mama and my little sister. When we got there, the deacon at the door took one look at us and said they were all out. But I could see boxes stacked high through the window." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not right." "No, it wasn't," Reverend Price agreed. "But here's what I remember most. Coming home empty-handed, we found Mrs. Martinez from next door waiting on our porch. She didn't have much herself, but she'd made a big pot of beans and cornbread, said she had too much to eat alone." He chuckled softly. "That woman never did learn to cook for less than an army." The pastor's weathered hands folded in his lap. "You see, Ethan, hunger's not just about empty stomachs, it's about dignity. When that deacon turned us away, he wasn't just denying us food, he was saying we weren't worth helping. But when Mrs. Martinez shared her table, she gave us more than a meal, she gave us community." Ethan absorbed this, thinking of Micah's innocent question in the garage that had started it all. "But how do I fight this, Reverend? The hearing's in 2 weeks, and Dale's got the council in his pocket." Reverend Price stood slowly, retrieving the zoning notice. "You know what I learned that summer? Sometimes the good Lord uses our hardest moments to build something bigger than ourselves. That church that turned us away? It got me thinking about what a real house of worship should be. Led me right to seminary. He smiled. And now look at our congregation, black, white, Latino, all sharing the same pews and the same communion table. But the garage isn't just about fixing cars anymore, is it, Reverend Bike? Price's voice grew firm. It's about fixing what's broken in our town. Dale Whitaker sees that, and it scares him. Change always scares folks who profit from keeping things the same. The pastor handed the notice back to Ethan. You've got more allies than you know, son. Grace sees it. That's why she chose your garage. The folks coming for food and fellowship, they see it too. Even little Micah understands something powerful is happening there. Ethan stood, feeling the weight of the paper in his hands differently now. I still don't know if I can win this fight. Maybe winning isn't about keeping things exactly as they are, Reverend Price suggested. Maybe it's about being faithful to what's right and letting God handle the rest. He patted Ethan's shoulder. Besides, you're a Marine. Since when do you back down from a worthy battle? The drive home felt lighter somehow. Ethan found Micah waiting on Ruth Ann's porch, homework finished, face brightening at his father's arrival. As they walked to the truck together, Micah looked up with those eyes that seemed to see right through grown-up pretenses. Are we going to lose the garage, Dad? Ethan knelt down to his son's level, the way he always did for important conversations. Reverend Price's words echoed in his mind. About dignity, about change, about faith in something bigger than himself. We're going to fight this, Ethan said firmly. Not just for us, for everybody. The garage bay doors stood wide open, letting in the late morning breeze. Where tool chests usually sat, folding tables now stretched end to end, covered with mixing bowls, baking dishes, and Ruth Ann's famous collection of spices. The scent of garlic and herbs filled the normally oil-scented air. Grace sat at a makeshift desk, really just a wooden plank laid across two sawhorses, studying a thick binder of zoning regulations. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she made notes in the margins. Ruth Ann moved between three crockpots, lifting lids and stirring contents with the efficiency of someone who'd coordinated countless church potlucks. The way to win hearts is through stomachs, Ruth Ann declared, adding another pinch of herbs to her signature chicken casserole. When people are well fed, they listen better. Ethan worked quietly in the corner on an old Buick, trying not to feel overwhelmed by the transformation of his workspace. The familiar rhythm of wrench against bolt helped steady his nerves. We've got 15 casseroles promised already, Ruth Ann continued, wiping her hands on her apron. Martha's bringing her sweet potato dish, and the Wilson sisters are doing those little ham rolls everyone loves. Grace looked up from her paperwork. Food's important, but we need voices too. Strong ones. Oh, I've got that covered. Ruth Ann's eyes twinkled as she checked another dish. The entire choir will be there, and I've called every member of my Sunday school class from the last 30 years. Volunteers bustled around them, mostly women from Ruth Ann's church circle, chopping vegetables and measuring ingredients. The garage had become an impromptu community kitchen, filled with the clatter of pans and murmured conversations. Ethan, Grace called softly. Come look at this section on conditional use permits. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and crossed to her desk, conscious of the grease stains on his coveralls amid all the cooking activity. Grace pointed to a paragraph, her finger tracing the lines. There's precedent for community service exceptions. 3 other businesses in town have them. Dale will fight it, Ethan said, his voice low. He's got friends on the council. Ruth Ann snorted from her cooking station. Dale's got enemies too, including his own wife, my sister Martha, who thinks he's being a fool about this whole thing. She straightened up, hands on her hips. And I've known those council members since they were in diapers. They might listen to Dale, but they still have to face their mothers in church on Sunday. A young volunteer dropped a metal bowl, making everyone jump. The clang echoed through the garage, followed by nervous laughter. Ethan helped her pick it up, noting her trembling hands. First time volunteering? He asked quietly. She nodded. I used to come to the food bank when my kids were little, she whispered. I wanted to help, you know. Give back? Ethan squeezed her shoulder gently. That's what this is all about. Grace watched the exchange, a small smile playing at her lips. She'd seen this happen before, how food and fellowship could transform a place, how sharing meals could build bridges. The afternoon wore on. Ruth Ann's army of volunteers filled the garage with the aromas of home cooking. They worked with the precision of a well-oiled machine, though this one produced casseroles instead of car repairs. We'll need to get these dishes to people before the meeting, Ruth Ann mused, making notes in her little spiral notebook. Everyone needs to eat early, so they can be there by 7. I can help deliver, Grace offered. My van's empty since we had to pause the pantry operations. The reminder of their suspended status hung heavy in the air. Ethan turned back to the Buick, tightening bolts with perhaps more force than necessary. As evening approached, the volunteers packed up their supplies, leaving behind a collection of covered dishes in Ruth Ann's portable warming boxes. The garage slowly emptied, returning to its familiar quiet. Grace gathered her papers, tucking them carefully into her briefcase. We've got good people on our side, Ethan, and a good cause. Sometimes that's not enough, he said softly, thinking of other battles he'd fought. It's always enough, Ruth Ann declared, removing her apron. Maybe not the way we expect, but good finds a way. After they left, Ethan closed up the garage and headed home. The small apartment above Frank's Hardware wasn't much, but it was home for now. He found Micah already in his pajamas, sitting cross-legged on his bed with a book. Hey, buddy. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, noting the worry in his son's eyes. Ready for sleep? Micah nodded, but his fingers fidgeted with the book's corner. As Ethan tucked the worn quilt around him, Micah's voice came out small and uncertain. Daddy, what if they say no? Ethan's heart clenched, but he kept his voice steady. Then, we'll make another way. The old municipal building's meeting room buzzed with anxious energy as people squeezed into every available space. Metal folding chairs scraped against the worn linoleum floor as latecomers tried to find spots along the walls. The familiar scent of Ruth Ann's casseroles and Martha's sweet potatoes wafted through the air from a table at the back. Ethan sat in the front row, his work shirt freshly pressed, but his hands still bearing traces of engine grease he couldn't quite scrub away. Micah sat beside him, small fingers clutching his father's calloused hand. Grace sat on Micah's other side, her usual calm presence, a steady anchor. Council President Thompson gavelled the meeting to order. We're here to address the zoning violation at Cole's Auto Service regarding unauthorized food distribution activities. Dale Whitaker rose from his council seat, straightening his tie. His polished appearance contrasted sharply with the working-class crowd filling the room. Fellow citizens, he began, his voice carrying a practiced politician's smoothness. This isn't about charity or feeding people. This is about maintaining proper zoning laws that protect our community's character and property values. He gestured to a PowerPoint slide showing traffic statistics. A food pantry will bring increased traffic, parking issues, and potential safety hazards. Do we want our quiet neighborhood turning into a hub for? He paused deliberately. Outside elements? A few heads nodded in agreement, but Ruth Ann, sitting nearby, clicked her tongue disapprovingly. Furthermore, Dale continued, Mr. Cole's garage is zoned strictly for automotive repair. Operating a food distribution center violates multiple ordinances. We must consider the precedent this would set. Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could stand, Reverend Price pushed himself up from his seat, his aged frame straight and dignified. I'd like to speak, if I may. The council president nodded, and the retired pastor made his way to the podium. His weathered face carried the wisdom of decades serving the community. I've lived in this town for 50 years, he began, his deep voice filling the room. I remember when certain doors weren't open to folks who looked like me, but I also remember those who shared what little they had, who saw past differences to recognize common humanity. He turned to face the crowd. That garage isn't just fixing cars anymore, it's fixing hearts. It's bringing people together who might never have met otherwise. Isn't that the kind of precedent we want to set? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. An elderly woman near the back called out, Amen! Next, Mrs. Chen from the downtown pharmacy approached the podium. Her quiet voice trembled slightly. "My grandson comes home from school hungry sometimes. His parents work 2 jobs each, but it's still not enough. That pantry would mean everything to families like ours." More residents stood to speak. A veteran in his dress uniform saluted Ethan before testifying about the importance of community service. A young mother described how car repairs and grocery money always competed in her monthly budget. Janelle Martinez, the town's code enforcement officer, unexpectedly asked to speak. "While the current zoning doesn't technically permit food distribution," she admitted, "the code allows for temporary waivers in cases of demonstrated community benefit. This seems like one of those cases." Dale shifted uncomfortably in his seat as more supporters spoke. The tide was turning. Finally, Ethan stood. He walked to the podium, his work boots heavy on the floor. For a moment, he just looked at the faces before him. Neighbors, customers, friends. "I'm not good at speeches," he began. "I'm better with engines than words, but I know what it's like to choose between fixing your car and filling your fridge. No parent should have to make that choice." His voice grew stronger. "This isn't just about food. It's about dignity. It's about community. When Grace proposed this partnership, I said yes because I was hungry, not just for food, but for purpose. This town raised me, supported me when I came back from service, kept bringing their cars to my shop even when bigger places opened up. Now, it's my turn to give back." He gestured to Micah. "My boy asked why we didn't have food. Thanks to this community, I can now tell him we have enough to share." The room fell silent. Council President Thompson cleared his throat. "We'll take a brief recess to deliberate." The next 15 minutes felt like hours. Ethan paced while Grace prayed quietly. Ruth Ann distributed her casserole to the anxious crowd. When the council returned, President Thompson spoke. "After careful consideration, and in light of overwhelming community support, we've decided to grant a 90-day temporary waiver for the food distribution program at Kohl's Auto Service, with the possibility of extension pending review." The room erupted in cheers. Micah jumped up and down, hugging his father's legs. Grace wiped tears from her eyes as Ruth Ann wrapped her in a fierce embrace. Ethan felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Reverend Price, smiling broadly. "See what happens when we build a bigger table?" The crowd began to sing. Someone had started Amazing Grace, and the old municipal building rang with hope and harmony. Even Dale's nephew, lurking in the back, seemed moved by the scene before him. People lined up to shake Ethan's hand, pat his back, offer congratulations. But his eyes sought out Micah, who beamed with pride at his father. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly full. Dawn painted the garage in soft golden light as Ethan rolled under the white delivery van on his creeper. The good wagon, as Grace had dubbed it, needed some serious TLC before it could safely transport food to families in need. The old Ford's undercarriage showed years of faithful service, with rust spots dotting the frame like autumn leaves. "Quarter-inch socket, buddy?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing in the quiet morning air. "Got it, Dad." Micah's sneakers squeaked on the concrete floor as he hurried to the red toolbox. He studied the sockets carefully, his tongue poking out in concentration as he found the right size. The tool felt solid and important in his small hands. "Here you go." Micah knelt beside the van, carefully passing the socket to his father's outstretched hand. "Perfect, son. You're getting real good at this." Ethan's praise made Micah's chest swell with pride. The gentle clink of metal against metal filled the bay as Ethan worked. He'd started extra early today, wanting to make sure everything was perfect for tomorrow's official opening. The transmission needed adjusting, the brakes required new pads, and the suspension groaned like it hadn't been serviced in years. "Dad?" Micah sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting nuts and bolts into small piles. "Is the good wagon gonna be okay?" Ethan slid out from under the van, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "She's got some miles on her, but we'll get her running smooth." He patted the van's white panel. "Just need someone to care enough to fix her up right." The morning light streamed through the garage's windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal mixed with the sweet aroma of the apple Danish that Ruth Ann had dropped off earlier. "Can I help wash it too?" Micah asked, already reaching for the bucket and sponge they kept in the corner. "You bet," Ethan smiled, watching his son's enthusiasm. "But first, hand me that brake fluid, would you?" As they worked together, the garage filled with the sounds of their easy conversation and occasional laughter. Micah told stories about school while passing tools, and Ethan explained each repair in simple terms his son could understand. Around mid-morning, Grace arrived with 2 paper cups of steaming coffee and a small hot chocolate for Micah. She leaned against the workbench, watching father and son in their synchronized dance of repairs. "How's our girl doing?" she asked, handing Ethan his coffee. "Getting there." Ethan took a grateful sip. "New brake pads are in, transmissions adjusted, and we're about to tackle that squeaky suspension." Grace ran her hand along the van's side, feeling the pitted paint under her fingers. "She's seen better days, but there's still plenty of life in her." "Just like this old garage," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. They worked through the morning, Micah proudly helping wash the van's exterior while Ethan finished the mechanical work. The white paint began to shine under their careful attention, and even the faded Neighbor's Table logo looked brighter. By early afternoon, Ethan closed the hood with a satisfying thunk. He'd checked and double-checked everything, wanting to be certain the good wagon would serve its new purpose reliably. The van sat in the center of the bay, gleaming in the sunlight, its engine purring smoothly during the final test. "Ready for a test drive?" Grace asked, jingling the keys. Ethan nodded, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Micah, want to ride along?" "Can I?" Micah's eyes lit up as he scrambled into the passenger seat, Grace sliding behind the wheel. The engine turned over smoothly, and the van eased forward. No squeaks, no rattles, just the sound of a well-maintained vehicle ready for its new mission. Grace guided it carefully out of the bay, the sunlight catching the freshly washed windshield. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching as the good wagon rolled smoothly onto the street. Grace's beaming smile matched Micah's excited wave from the passenger window. The van moved with renewed purpose, ready for tomorrow's first official food pantry day. The morning sun cast long shadows across the garage floor as Janelle Brooks stepped through the bay doors, her clipboard held tight against her navy blazer. Her sensible shoes clicked against the concrete, echoing in the quiet space. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the premises with practiced efficiency. Ethan looked up from the good wagon's engine, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Morning, Miss Brooks," he said, keeping his voice neutral. He'd dealt with enough inspectors to know that showing anxiety only made things worse. "Mr. Cole." Janelle's tone was crisp as autumn air. She made a note on her clipboard. "I'm here for the mandatory inspection following the temporary waiver approval." Micah appeared from behind the good wagon, curiosity bright in his eyes. He watched as Janelle measured doorways and checked exit signs with her laser level. "The fire extinguishers were serviced last month," Ethan offered, pointing to the inspection tags. Janelle merely nodded, her pen scratching against paper. The sound felt loud in the tense atmosphere. "Ventilation system needs documentation," she said, not looking up. "And these shelving units, they'll need to be properly secured to the wall." Ethan's shoulders tightened. Every requirement meant more money, more time. But he kept his voice steady. "Yes, ma'am, we'll take care of it." Micah had been watching the exchange, his head tilted thoughtfully. He disappeared into the small office and returned carrying a paper bag. "Would you like a muffin, Miss Brooks?" he asked, holding up the bag. "Mrs. Ruth Ann made them fresh this morning. They're blueberry." Janelle paused, her pen hovering over the clipboard. She looked down at Micah, seeming to really see him for the first time. That's very kind, but I'm here in an official capacity." "Dad says being official doesn't mean you can't be hungry," Micah said simply. The paper bag crinkled as he reached in and pulled out a perfectly round muffin, still slightly warm. Something shifted in Janelle's expression, subtle, like sun breaking through clouds. Her professional mask softened at the edges. "Well," she said, her voice gentler, "I suppose I haven't had breakfast yet." She accepted the muffin, and Micah beamed. Ethan watched as she took a small bite, a hint of surprise crossing her face. "This is very good," she admitted. "Mrs. Ruth Ann says food tastes better when it's shared," Micah said, settling onto his usual chair near the tool bench. Janelle's clipboard lowered slightly. Her eyes swept the garage again, but this time they lingered on the crayon-drawn sign about fixing cars and filling carts, the neatly organized food storage areas, the carefully maintained good wagon. "You've done considerable work here," she said, her tone warmer than before. "The ventilation system, is that new?" "Installed it myself last week," Ethan replied, "just waiting on the final certification paperwork." Janelle made another note, but her pen moved less sharply across the page. She took another bite of the muffin, brushing a crumb from her blazer. "The shelving units," she said, walking over to examine them. "They're well constructed. You'll just need the proper wall anchors. I can provide the specifications for those." "That would be helpful," Ethan said, surprised by the offer of assistance. Micah had started organizing tools, humming softly as he worked. The simple tune seemed to fill the space, making it feel less like an inspection and more like a morning visit. Janelle completed her circuit of the garage, occasionally pausing to make notes. But her movements had lost their rigid efficiency, becoming more thoughtful, considered. "Your fire safety plan is well documented," she said, reviewing her clipboard. "And the accessibility modifications exceed minimum requirements." She hesitated, then added, "That's uncommon. Most businesses do the bare minimum." "We want everyone to feel welcome here," Micah piped up from his corner. "That's what Grace says, everyone deserves a seat at the table." Janelle's face softened further, and something that might have been a smile touched her lips. It transformed her whole appearance, making her seem younger, more approachable. "Well," she said, straightening her blazer, "I'll need to file my official report, but I don't see any major compliance issues. Minor corrections only, easily addressed." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card, holding it out to Ethan. "When you have the ventilation certification, you can send it directly to my office, and I'll email those shelving specifications this afternoon." "Thank you," Ethan said, reading genuine helpfulness in her expression. "Would you like another muffin to take with you?" Micah asked hopefully. This time, Janelle's smile was unmistakable. "I probably shouldn't, but yes, thank you." As she accepted the second muffin, her professional demeanor had softened completely. She tucked it carefully into her briefcase, next to her clipboard. "Good luck with everything, Mr. Cole," she said, heading toward the door. She paused, looking back. "What you're doing here, it matters." Ethan stood in the doorway of his garage, watching as Janelle walked to her city-issued car. Her usual stiff-backed stride seemed different somehow, less rigid. He noticed how she glanced back at the garage once more before driving away, that unexpected smile still lingering on her face. The morning light streamed through the garage's windows, casting golden rectangles on the freshly swept concrete floor. What was usually a workspace filled with tools and the scent of motor oil had transformed into something entirely different. Clean white tablecloths draped over oil drums now held mountains of red potatoes and sweet onions. The hydraulic car lifts, lowered halfway, served as makeshift shelving units displaying boxes of cereal and canned goods. Ethan stood near the entrance, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, watching as volunteers in bright yellow aprons arranged fresh produce. The familiar sense of grease and gasoline had given way to the earthy smell of vegetables and the sweet aroma of donated bread from Marshall's bakery. "Everything's ready, Ethan," Grace called from across the room. She adjusted a sign that read, "Welcome Neighbors," in Micah's careful handwriting. Her dark eyes sparkled with pride as she surveyed their handiwork. Ruth Ann bustled about, directing volunteers like she was conducting her choir. "Janet, honey, those apples need to be closer to the front. And Tom, make sure there's enough space between the tables for folks with walkers." Micah darted between the stations, his sneakers squeaking on the floor. He'd insisted on wearing his own yellow apron, even though it wrapped around him twice. "Dad, look," he called out, pointing to where he'd arranged boxes of macaroni and cheese into a perfect pyramid. The first guests began arriving right at 9 o'clock. Ethan's throat tightened as he recognized faces from around town. The elderly Johnson couple who'd lost their pension, young Maria from the diner who worked 2 jobs to support her kids, and others he'd seen but never really known. "Welcome," Grace greeted each person warmly, explaining how the system worked. "Take what you need, and please, don't hesitate to ask for help carrying items to your car." An older man in a faded Marine Corps cap made his way through the door, leaning heavily on his cane. Ethan recognized him as Mr. Patterson from the VFW hall. The veteran's eyes widened as he took in the transformed garage, then settled on Ethan. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted his cane to his left hand and raised his right hand in a crisp salute. Ethan returned the gesture automatically, muscle memory from his own service days taking over. "At ease, sir," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Semper Fi, son." Mr. Patterson replied. "You're still serving, just in a different way now." He gestured at the bustling room. This is what we fought for." As the morning progressed, the garage hummed with activity. Children helped their parents pick out fresh fruit. Elderly neighbors chatted while comparing recipes for canned vegetables, and teenagers from the high school volunteer club carried boxes to waiting cars. A young mother with twin toddlers looked close to tears when she saw the stack of diapers. "I didn't expect. I was just hoping for some food," she stammered. "We try to stock what families need," Grace explained gently. "Take enough for the week." Ethan worked steadily, restocking shelves and helping carry heavy items. He caught glimpses of Micah throughout the morning, proudly showing other kids where to find their favorite cereals or helping elderly visitors reach items on higher shelves. Near noon, as the crowd began to thin, Ruth Ann gathered everyone in the center of the garage. "Before folks head home," she announced in her choir director's voice, "I think we should mark this blessed day with a song." She paused, looking around the room with shining eyes. Amazing grace! How sweet the sound! One by one, voices joined in. Grace's clear soprano, Mr. Patterson's deep bass, the children's high, sweet notes, and dozens more blended together. The melody filled every corner of the garage, transforming it once again, this time into something like a cathedral. That saved a wretch like me. Ethan didn't sing. He couldn't pass the lump in his throat. Instead, he watched as people swayed gently to the familiar hymn, their arms full of groceries, their faces full of hope. Micah stood beside him, clutching his hand and humming along. "I once was lost, but now am found." The sunlight seemed to grow brighter as the song swelled, catching dust motes in the air and making them dance like golden stars. In that moment, the garage wasn't just a place where cars got fixed, or even where food was shared. It was holy ground. "Was blind, but now I see." As the final notes faded away, people began making their way out, carrying bags and boxes full of food. They left with more than just groceries. They left with dignity, with hope, with the knowledge that they weren't alone. Each smile, each thank you, each grateful nod told the same story. This was more than a pantry. It was a community finding its heart. The morning bustle at the transformed garage filled the air with cheerful chatter and the rustle of paper bags. A young woman in a navy blazer knelt beside Micah, holding out a small microphone. Her press badge read, "Sarah Chen, Maple Hollow Herald." "So, Micah," Sarah said gently, "can you tell me what's special about today?" Micah glanced at his father, who was helping an elderly woman pack canned goods into her rolling cart. The boy's fingers played with the hem of his t-shirt as he gathered his thoughts. "Today, we have enough to share," Micah said softly, his voice carrying a simple truth that made Sarah's pen pause over her notepad. "And what does that mean to you?" she asked. Micah's face brightened. "It means nobody has to be hungry, like how Jimmy at school always shares his cookies with me at lunch. Now we can do that for everybody." From across the room, Ethan watched the interview while stacking boxes of cereal. Pride swelled in his chest, threatening to burst. His son's innocent wisdom had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things. Sarah continued her questions, and Micah led her on a tour of their makeshift pantry. He showed her how they'd turned the tool chest into a bread station, its drawers now holding different types of rolls and loaves instead of wrenches and screwdrivers. "And look," Micah pointed excitedly to the car lift. "That's where we put the fruit. Dad says it's like a fancy grocery store display, But better 'cause it's ours." Grace appeared beside Ethan, watching Micah charm the reporter. "That boy of yours has quite a way with words," she said, smiling. "Gets it from his mother," Ethan replied softly, his voice thick with emotion. The morning progressed steadily. Volunteers moved with growing confidence, having found their rhythm. Ruth Ann orchestrated the flow of people like she conducted her choir, making sure everyone felt welcome and no one left empty-handed. Around noon, Grace pulled Ethan aside into his small office. The desk, usually covered in repair invoices and parts catalogs, now held clipboards with volunteer schedules and food inventory lists. "Ethan, we need to talk," Grace said, settling into the chair across from him. Her expression was serious, but warm. "What you've done here, it's exactly what Neighbor's Table needs." Ethan shook his head. "I haven't done much, just provided the space." "No," Grace insisted. "You've done so much more. You've shown us how to make this work in a small town. The way you've integrated the pantry with your garage, how you've maintained the vehicles, organized the logistics. It's brilliant in its simplicity." She pulled out a folder and placed it on the desk. "We want to expand this model to other communities, small towns like Maple Hollow, where traditional food banks might not work, but a hybrid approach could thrive." Ethan's hands stilled on the box of inventory forms he'd been organizing. "What are you saying?" "I'm offering you a position," Grace said. "Fleet and facilities lead for Neighbor's Table. Full-time, with benefits." She slid the folder toward him. "You'd oversee our vehicle maintenance program across the region and help set up more locations like this one. We need someone who understands both the mechanical side and the heart of what we're doing." The words hit Ethan like a physical force. A real job, benefits, security, everything he'd been struggling to provide for Micah. His throat tightened. Through the office window, he could see Micah helping a younger child pick out an apple from the fruit display. His son handled each piece of fruit with care, showing the same gentleness he used when passing tools in the garage. Ethan's voice caught. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Grace said simply. "You've already proven you're perfect for this. And Micah," she gestured toward the window, "he's shown us all what it means to share with an open heart." Ethan stood and walked to the window, watching his son. Micah looked up just then and waved, his smile bright enough to light up the whole garage. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as the full weight of the moment settled over him. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a chance to turn their struggle into something meaningful, to help other families avoid the shame and uncertainty they'd faced, to teach Micah that asking for help could lead to helping others. Grace stood beside him, watching Micah continue his apple selection ceremony with another family. "You know," she said quietly, "sometimes the best way to heal our own hunger is to help feed others." Ethan nodded, unable to speak as tears rolled down his cheeks. Through blurred vision, he watched his son, his bright, compassionate boy, who had started all of this with one honest question about food, show another child how to check if a pear was ripe. Stars dotted the clear night sky as Ethan and Micah walked home from the garage. The day's success had left them both tired but happy. Micah skipped ahead, then waited for his father to catch up, their footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalk. "Did you see how many people came today, Dad?" Micah's voice carried through the quiet street. "Sure did, buddy." Ethan smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "You did great with that interview, too." "I was nervous." Micah kicked a pebble. "But Miss Chen was nice. She said our story might help other towns do the same thing." They turned onto Cedar Street, where their small rental house waited. The porch light cast a warm glow, a beacon in the darkness. Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly. It had been a long day of juggling car repairs and food distribution. After getting Micah settled into bed, Ethan sat at their worn kitchen table, going through receipts and inventory lists. Grace had left them organized in neat stacks, but his eyes kept drifting to the window. Something felt unsettled in his gut, like the calm before a storm. The phone's harsh ring shattered the silence. Ethan grabbed it quickly before it could wake Micah. "Mr. Cole?" The voice was urgent. "This is dispatch. There's a fire at your garage." The words hit him like a physical blow. Ethan's hands went numb. "I'll call Mrs. Martinez next door," he managed. "She can watch Micah." Everything after that became a blur of motion. The neighbor arriving. Micah sleeping peacefully, unaware. Ethan running down dark streets, his heart pounding with each step. The night air carried the acrid smell of smoke before he even rounded the corner. Then he saw it, his garage engulfed in angry orange flames that reached toward the sky. Fire trucks' red lights painted the scene in surreal flashes. The wail of sirens filled the air. "Grace's car is here!" someone shouted. "She must have come back to finish paperwork." Ethan's blood ran cold. He sprinted toward the building, but strong hands held him back. "Let the professionals handle it," a firefighter ordered. Helpless, Ethan watched as crews battled the blaze. Water arced through the air, turning to steam as it hit the inferno. The heat was intense even from where he stood. Then movement at the side door. 2 firefighters emerging with Grace between them. She was coughing violently, her face streaked with soot. They guided her to a waiting ambulance, where paramedics fitted an oxygen mask over her face. Ethan started toward her, but something caught his eye. There, illuminated by the flames and emergency lights, was the garage's back wall. His steps faltered as he made out what had been spray-painted there, a symbol of hate, stark and ugly against the brick. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had tried to hurt them, to destroy what they'd built. His legs gave out. The rough asphalt bit into his knees as he collapsed in the middle of the street, watching flames consume his livelihood and their dreams of helping others. All around him, neighbors gathered in their nightclothes, watching in horror as the garage burned. The symbol on the wall seemed to mock them all, a declaration of the hatred that still lurked in their town's shadows. The very thing Grace's father had once represented, the bigotry she'd spent her life trying to make right, now scarred their own wall. Steam and smoke billowed into the night sky, obscuring the stars that had seemed so peaceful just hours before. The siren's wail echoed off buildings, a mournful chorus for all they were losing. And Ethan remained on his knees in the street, unable to move, unable to process how quickly their hopes had turned to ashes. Dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and pink as Ethan Cole stood before the charred remains of his garage. The acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air, mixing with the morning dew. Next to him, Micah clutched his father's hand, his small fingers wrapped tightly around Ethan's calloused palm. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the morning breeze, marking off the blackened shell of what had been their livelihood. The windows were shattered, and the metal door hung askew on its hinges. The hate symbol spray-painted on the back wall seemed to mock them through the haze. "I did this," Ethan whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I brought this danger to our doorstep. To you." He looked down at his son, guilt weighing heavily on his shoulders. Fire investigators moved around the scene, taking photos and making notes. Their radio chatter seemed distant and unreal to Ethan's ears. Every snap of their cameras felt like an accusation. Grace approached them, her arm in a sling from the smoke inhalation treatment. "Ethan, this isn't your fault," she said softly. But Ethan shook his head, his jaw tight. "Look at this mess. Look what could have happened. My boy could have been here when..." His voice cracked, unable to finish the thought. "Dad?" Micah tugged at his sleeve, but Ethan was lost in his spiral of self-blame. 2 police officers approached, their notebooks ready. "Mr. Cole, we need to ask you a few more questions." Ethan nodded numbly. "Micah, go sit with Ms. Grace for a minute." As the morning wore on, more people gathered. Ruth Ann brought coffee and donuts. Volunteers who had celebrated with them just yesterday now stood in shocked clusters, whispering and wiping tears. Some began picking up debris, determined to do something, anything to help. "I should have known better," Ethan muttered to himself as he watched them work. "Should have stuck to fixing cars, should have kept my head down." By afternoon, the initial shock had given way to a bone-deep weariness. Ethan sat on the curb, staring at the ruins of his dream. The job offer from neighbor's table felt like ashes in his mouth now. How could he think about expanding when he couldn't even keep his own place safe? Reverend Price's old pickup truck rumbled up around sunset. The retired pastor stepped out slowly, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the damage. Without a word, he walked over and sat next to Ethan on the curb. "I'm done, Reverend," Ethan said quietly. "Can't risk it any more. Can't risk him." He nodded toward Micah, who was helping volunteers stack salvage tools. "Come to my house," Reverend Price said firmly. "We need to talk this through properly." The evening found them gathered on Reverend Price's wide front porch. The old pastor had called an informal meeting, and people kept arriving. Grace, Ruth Ann, regular volunteers, even Janelle, the code officer. They brought chairs from inside, sat on the steps, leaned against the railing. Ethan stood apart, arms crossed, fighting the urge to leave. Every concerned face, every kind word felt like more weight on his shoulders. "I appreciate everyone coming," he said stiffly, "but I've made up my mind. I'm declining the job offer, Grace. The pantry needs to find another location." "I can't," he swallowed hard. "I can't be responsible for putting people in danger." Protests erupted from the gathered group. Grace tried to speak, but Ethan held up his hand. "My boy comes first," he said firmly. "Always has, always will. And today showed me just how close to disaster we came." The porch fell silent. In that quiet moment, Micah slipped away inside. When he returned, he pressed something into his father's hand, a folded piece of paper. Ethan opened it slowly. In Micah's careful schoolboy writing were 6 simple words. "We can fix cars. We can fix this." The note trembled in Ethan's hands as he read it again and again, while the gathered community waited in respectful silence on Reverend Price's old wooden porch. Janelle Brooks sat in her dimly lit office, the glow of her computer monitor illuminating her face. The clock on the wall ticked past 9 p.m., but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the garage fire. 20 years of code enforcement had taught her to trust her instincts. She rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her now cold coffee. On her desk lay the preliminary fire investigation report. Inconclusive, but pointing to arson. The images of the burned garage haunted her, especially the memory of Micah's crayon sign turned to ash. "Think, Janelle," she muttered to herself. "What are we missing?" She pulled up the security footage from Thompson's hardware store across the street. The owner had dropped off the files that afternoon, but she'd been too swamped with meetings to review them. Now, in the quiet of her office, she clicked play. The black and white video showed the usual evening traffic. A few cars passed by, their headlights creating brief flashes across the screen. Nothing suspicious. She fast-forwarded through hours of footage, her eyes scanning for any movement. At 11:42 p.m., a figure caught her attention. She leaned closer to the screen, rewinding and playing it again at normal speed. A young man in a hoodie walked past the hardware store, looking over his shoulder repeatedly. Something about his gait seemed familiar. Janelle switched to another camera angle, this one showing the alley behind the garage. The same figure appeared, now moving with purpose. He carried something in his hands, a container of some sort. The way he moved, the slight limp in his walk. "Wait a minute," Janelle whispered, reaching for her phone. She scrolled through recent photos from the town hall meeting, stopping at one showing Councilman Dale Whitaker and his family. In the background, barely visible, stood his nephew. The same build, the same distinctive walk. Her heart began to race. She'd seen Dale's nephew around town plenty of times, usually hanging out behind the old movie theater with his friends. He had that same slight limp from a skateboarding accident last summer. Janelle zoomed in on the footage frame by frame. The young man looked directly at the camera for just a moment before pulling his hood lower, but that split second was enough. The sharp nose, the angular jaw, it was definitely Dale's nephew. She watched in growing horror as the footage showed him disappearing behind the garage. 12 minutes later, the first wisps of smoke appeared on camera. Shortly after, the figure ran back through the alley, disappearing into the night. "Oh God," Janelle breathed, sitting back in her chair. The implications hit her hard. Dale Whitaker's own nephew, the same council member who had fought so hard against the food pantry. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone. This wasn't just about code violations anymore. This was about hate, about violence, about a community being torn apart. She thought about all the times she'd hidden behind regulations and paperwork, trying to stay neutral in a town that was anything but. The phone felt heavy in her hand as she pulled up Grace's number. Then Ethan's. They needed to know, but this would change everything. The truth would ripple through their small town like a stone thrown into still water. She glanced at Micah's muffin wrapper still sitting on the corner of her desk from his visit last week. Such a small gesture of kindness from a child who had so little yet gave so freely. Taking a deep breath, Janelle dialed Grace's number first, then added Ethan to make it a conference call. "I'm sorry to call so late," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But I think we have your arsonist." Ruth Ann's living room felt small with so many people crowded inside. Dale's nephew slouched on the floral couch, his lanky teenage frame trying to look tough despite his trembling hands. Janelle stood by the window, arms crossed, while Dale occupied an armchair near his nephew. Ruth Ann positioned herself directly across from the boy, her usually warm eyes now steely with determination. "We have the security footage," Janelle said quietly, her tablet displaying grainy images of a figure skulking behind the garage. "I've watched it 3 times. It's you." The nephew's jaw clenched. "You can't prove nothing." But his voice cracked on the last word. "Son," Dale started, but Ruth Ann cut him off with a sharp look. "Let him speak for himself, Dale. You've done enough talking for him already." The boy's eyes darted between the adults, like a cornered animal searching for escape. His knee bounced rapidly, betraying his nerves despite his attempted swagger. "I didn't do nothing wrong," he insisted. But the words rang hollow. "That place was changing everything. Bringing in all sorts of people. It wasn't right." Ruth Ann leaned forward in her chair. "What wasn't right about feeding hungry families? They're not from here." The words burst from him like a dam breaking. "Uncle Dale said—" He stopped abruptly, glancing at his uncle. Dale's face reddened. "Now wait just a minute. What did Uncle Dale say?" Ruth Ann's voice was quiet but firm. The nephew's tough facade began to crack. He said the garage was going to bring down property values, that those people would take over the neighborhood. His voice grew smaller with each word. "I just wanted to help, to keep things the way they were." "The way they were?" Ruth Ann's voice sharpened. "You mean the way they were when Ethan's little boy went hungry? When families had to choose between fixing their cars and feeding their children?" Tears welled in the boy's eyes. I didn't think about the kid. I just wanted." His voice broke completely. "I wanted Uncle Dale to be proud of me." The room fell silent except for the teenager's ragged breathing. Dale stared at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Do you know what you've done?" Ruth Ann asked, her voice gentler now. "Not just to the garage, but to people's lives? To their trust in each other?" The nephew's shoulders began to shake. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. When I saw Miss Grace coming out of there coughing." He covered his face with his hands, his carefully maintained toughness crumbling entirely. Ruth Ann moved to sit beside him on the couch, placing a firm but comforting hand on his shoulder. "Being sorry is a start, but it's not enough. You understand that, don't you?" He nodded miserably through his tears. Ruth Ann turned her attention to Dale, who hadn't moved from his chair. "Your words did this, Dale. Your prejudice, your fear-mongering. This boy acted on the poison you've been spreading." Dale shifted uncomfortably. "Now see here, Ruth Ann." "No, you see here." Ruth Ann's voice carried the authority of decades of choir directing. "Your nephew is going to face consequences for what he did, but you're going to face yours too. What do you expect me to do?" Dale's voice was defensive, but there was a tremor of uncertainty in it. "First, you're going to go to the police with him and make a full statement. Then, you're going to step down from the council." Ruth Ann's eyes bored into him. "And finally, you're going to help make this right." "Step down?" Dale sputtered. "You can't. I can, and I will." Ruth Ann stood, drawing herself up to her full height. "Either you do the right thing, or I'll tell everyone in this town how your words put that match in this boy's hand. How your prejudice nearly killed Grace Alvarez. How your hatred turned your own nephew into an arsonist." Dale looked at his nephew, still crying quietly on the couch, then back at Ruth Ann. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking old and tired. "What's happened to this town?" he asked softly. "It's changing, Dale. It's growing into something better. The question is, are you going to help it grow, or are you going to burn it down?" Dale was quiet for a long moment, looking at his nephew. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "I'll cooperate," he said quietly. "I'll do whatever needs to be done." Ruth Ann nodded, satisfaction and sadness mingling in her expression. "That's a start, Dale. That's a start." The old wooden church creaked under the weight of a full congregation that Sunday morning. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across worn pews and worried faces. Ethan sat in the back row with Micah, his work-roughened hands clasped tightly in his lap. Reverend Price stood at the pulpit, his gentle voice carrying through the hushed sanctuary. "Today, we gather not just for worship, but for healing. We have a young member of our community who wishes to speak." Dale's nephew shuffled to the front, his shoulders hunched and his face pale. Gone was the tough exterior he usually wore like armor. Instead, he looked small and lost in his ill-fitting Sunday clothes. His hands trembled as they gripped the wooden podium. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I did something terrible." The silence in the church grew heavier. Ruth Ann, sitting in the choir section, reached for her husband Dale's hand. Dale's face was drawn with shame. "I'm the one who burned down Mr. Cole's garage." The words tumbled out in a rush. "I spray-painted that awful symbol too, I thought." He swallowed hard. "I thought I was protecting our town from changing. But I was wrong. So wrong." Micah pressed closer to Ethan's side. Ethan wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, remembering the fear in those young eyes when they'd stood before the smoking ruins of their livelihood. The nephew continued, his voice growing thick with tears. "I could have killed someone. Miss Alvarez was inside. I didn't know." He broke down, his shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Reverend Price placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. The morning light caught the minister's silver hair like a halo. "The Lord teaches us that confession is the first step toward redemption, but what comes next matters just as much." Ethan stood slowly. Every eye in the church turned to him. He walked down the center aisle, his work boots echoing against the wooden floor. The nephew seemed to shrink with each step Ethan took toward him. "Look at me, son," Ethan said quietly. The boy raised his tear-stained face. "What you did was wrong. You destroyed something precious, not just a building, but a symbol of hope for folks who needed it." Ethan's voice was firm, but not unkind. "But I don't believe hate wins. Not here. Not today." Grace, sitting near the front, wiped her eyes with a tissue. Her throat still showed traces of smoke exposure. "I want you to help us rebuild," Ethan continued. "Not just a few hours of picking up trash. I mean real work. Learning what it means to create instead of destroy. To serve instead of fear." The nephew nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. Anything. You'll work alongside people who don't look like you or think like you. You'll serve meals to families who need help. You'll learn their names, hear their stories." "I will," the boy whispered. "I promise." Dale stood up then, his councilman's authority stripped away by grief and responsibility. "My nephew will be there every day, Mr. Cole. And so will I." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Ruth Ann's face shone with tears and pride. Reverend Price raised his hands. "In this house of God, we believe in transformation. We believe that hearts can change. Would you all stand and join hands?" The rustle of movement filled the sanctuary as people rose. Ethan found himself between Grace and the nephew, who hesitated before tentatively taking his hand. Micah slipped forward to complete the circle. "Lord," Reverend Price prayed, his rich voice carrying to every corner, "we ask for your healing touch today, for the courage to face our wrongs, for the strength to forgive, for the wisdom to learn from our mistakes. The morning sun strengthened, pouring through the windows in sheets of gold and blue and rose. It touched every bowed head, every clasped hand, every heart struggling toward grace. Help us build something better from these ashes. Help us remember that your love is bigger than our fear, your mercy greater than our mistakes. Amen, the congregation whispered. In that moment of shared prayer, Ethan felt the nephew's hand stop trembling. He squeezed it gently, the way he might reassure Micah after a nightmare. The boy squeezed back, and in that simple gesture lay the first fragile seeds of healing. Ruth Ann Whitaker's sensible shoes clicked against the cracked sidewalk as she led a small group toward the abandoned firehouse. The two-story brick building sat like a sleeping giant in the heart of downtown, its red-painted doors faded to a dusty rose. Cobwebs draped the corners of tall windows like tattered lace curtains. "Now, I know it doesn't look like much," Ruth Ann said, fishing an old key from her purse. The metal protested as she turned it in the lock. "But just you wait." Ethan hung back, his hands in his pockets, while Micah pressed close to his side. Grace stood nearby, her notebook already open, jotting down observations. A handful of regular volunteers clustered behind them, murmuring amongst themselves. The door groaned open, releasing a puff of stale air. Ruth Ann felt along the wall and found the light switch. Ancient fluorescent tubes flickered reluctantly to life, revealing a cavernous space filled with shadows and memories. "My Harold used to work here," Ruth Ann said softly, her voice echoing. 25 years as a firefighter. I remember bringing him dinner right where we're standing." The main bay stretched before them, wide enough for 3 fire trucks. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air. The concrete floor bore traces of where the trucks once parked, like ghost outlines of mechanical beasts long departed. "Look at all this space," Grace breathed, walking forward. Her footsteps echoed. "The ceiling height is perfect for storage racks. And these bay doors." She ran a hand along the metal track. "They're still solid." Micah darted ahead, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Dad, there's a pole!" He pointed to the brass fire pole that connected the upper floor to the ground level, its surface dulled with age but still proud. Ethan moved slower, his mechanic's eye taking in every detail. "Electrical's going to need work," he noted, examining an ancient fuse box. "But the bones are good. Real good." Ruth Ann led them upstairs, where old offices lined a long hallway. "This could be perfect for counseling spaces," she said. "So many folks need more than just food. They need someone to talk to." The kitchen area still had its industrial-grade stove and massive sink, though years of disuse had left them looking forlorn. Grace opened and closed cabinet doors, making notes. With some updating, this kitchen could serve hundreds. A volunteer sneezed as they disturbed more dust, but her eyes were bright with possibility. "We could host cooking classes here," she suggested. "Teach people how to use the food they get." They gathered in what had once been the firefighters' common room. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating worn floorboards and peeling paint. An old mural of the town's first fire brigade still decorated one wall, the colors faded but the faces still watching over the room with pride. "The roof's solid," Ethan reported, having climbed up to check. "Some minor repairs needed, but nothing major." Ruth Ann clasped her hands together. "Well, what do you all think?" The volunteers began talking all at once, their voices overlapping with excitement. "Those bay doors would make it so easy to unload the delivery trucks. We could set up a proper waiting area, with real chairs. The kitchen? Just imagine the meals we could prepare." Grace had been quiet, running numbers in her head and making calculations in her notebook. She cleared her throat, and the chatter died down. "The renovation costs would be significant," she began, and faces fell around the room. "But..." A smile spread across her face. "Neighbors Table has been looking to establish a flagship location for our expanded services model, something that combines food distribution with community support, education, and gathering spaces." She turned in a slow circle, taking in the potential of the space. "This building, it's perfect. The location, the layout, the history of service to the community." Her voice grew stronger. "Neighbors Table will fund the renovations." The announcement hung in the air for a moment before the room erupted in cheers. Ruth Ann dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief while volunteers hugged each other. Micah jumped up and down, tugging on his father's sleeve. Ethan stood still, overcome. This wasn't just a replacement for his garage, it was something bigger, something that could help more people than he'd ever dreamed possible. Grace caught his eye and nodded, understanding in her expression. Ruth Ann raised her hands for quiet. Just think. Where fire trucks once rolled out to save our town, now we'll roll out hope and help to our neighbors. Her voice caught. I'd say that's keeping the spirit of this old place alive. The cheering started again, echoing off the high ceilings and bouncing through the empty bays. The sound filled every dusty corner, every shadowy space, like a promise of what was to come. Grace stepped forward, her notebook tucked under her arm, a quiet smile on her face as she watched the celebration unfold. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching the dust motes that swirled in the air like golden confetti, turning the old firehouse into a cathedral of possibility. The heavy firehouse doors groaned open, releasing decades of dust into the morning light. Ethan Cole stepped inside, his work boots crunching on debris. The cavernous space stretched before him, still holding traces of its past life. Brass poles gleaming dully, numbered parking bays marked on the concrete floor, and old schedules yellowing on bulletin boards. "Look, Dad!" Micah's voice echoed as he pointed to faded measurements painted on the walls, once used to track the height of young firefighters. "Can we measure me too?" Before Ethan could answer, volunteers began streaming in through the open doors. They carried mops, brooms, and cleaning supplies, their faces bright with purpose. Ruth Ann directed traffic like a seasoned conductor, assigning tasks with gentle authority. "Martha, you take the windows. Tom and Pete, let's get those cobwebs down. Grace, dear, you and I will tackle that kitchen area." The work began in earnest. Brooms swept in rhythm across the floor, stirring up clouds that danced in the sunbeams streaming through freshly cleaned windows. The air filled with the sharp scent of pine cleaner and the soft swish of rags against glass. Old fire hoses, too stiff for their original purpose but still strong, found new life as handrails along the walls. Ethan worked with 2 other men to secure them properly, his hands remembering the satisfaction of creating something useful. "These old hoses," he murmured, running a calloused hand along the canvas surface, "they used to save lives. Still will, just in a different way now." By noon, the first day's cleaning crew had made significant progress. The main floor gleamed, and the kitchen area showed promise beneath its layers of grime. Volunteers shared sandwiches and lemonade, sitting on folding chairs in what would become the dining area. The next morning brought the painters, white primer-covered water stains and old smoke marks, brightening the space. Children, supervised by parents, decorated the lower walls with handprints in cheerful colors. Each print became a flower, a bird, or a butterfly under their imaginative touch. Micah worked with particular concentration on the front window. His small hands carefully guided a brush, painting "Neighbor's Table" in bright blue letters. The S went backward at first, but Grace helped him fix it, her gentle guidance making him beam with pride. "That's beautiful, honey," she said, ruffling his hair. "Everyone who passes by will know exactly where to come for help." The transformation continued over the next few days. Old engine bay numbers became measurement marks for food portions. Where fire trucks once parked, long tables took their place, ready to hold boxes of produce and canned goods. The kitchen, once used for quick meals between calls, now gleamed with donated commercial equipment. Women from the church quilting circle hung bright tapestries on the walls, softening the industrial space with warmth and color. Each piece told a story. One showed bread and fishes, another depicted hands joined in fellowship around a table. The brass poles remained, polished to a mirror shine. "They're part of the building's history," Ruth Ann declared. "And they make fine places to hang holiday decorations." Ethan worked tirelessly, his skills finding new purpose in every corner. He installed better lighting, repaired ancient plumbing, and engineered a pulley system for moving heavy boxes of food to the second floor. Each repair felt like healing, like building something larger than himself. The old chief's office became a welcome center, its walls now covered with community resources and sign-up sheets for volunteers. The dispatch room transformed into a play area where children could safely wait while their parents collected food or attended cooking classes. On the fourth day, as evening approached, Ethan stood in the center of the main room. Sawdust coated his boots, and paint speckled his shirt. Around him, the space hummed with possibility. Shelves lined the walls where fire gear once hung. A donated refrigerator purred softly in the kitchen. The floor, though still concrete, had been painted with a warm terracotta color that made the whole space feel more inviting. Micah appeared at his side, small hand slipping into his father's larger one. Together, they looked at what the community had built. The setting sun streamed through the windows, catching the fresh paint and making the brass poles glow like warm honey. "It's so different now," Micah said, his voice full of wonder. Ethan squeezed his son's hand, feeling the truth of what they'd accomplished settle in his chest. The space that once housed engines ready to fight fires would now fight a different kind of emergency. Where sirens once called men to action, hope would now call people to community. "We're building more than walls," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The old town hall's wooden benches creaked under the weight of concerned citizens. Evening sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The council chamber, usually half empty for routine meetings, was packed shoulder to shoulder tonight. Ethan Cole sat in the back row, his calloused hands clasped tightly in his lap. Grace Alvarez sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. Through the crowd, they could see Dale Whitaker at the council table, his shoulders hunched beneath his navy blazer. The man looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of recent events. Council President Martha Jensen called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. "Before we proceed with regular business, Councilman Whitaker has requested the floor." A hush fell over the room. Dale stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his reading glasses. Papers rustled as he cleared his throat. "I've served on this council for 18 years, he began, his voice rougher than usual. "I thought I knew what was best for our town, I thought." He paused, removing his glasses to wipe them with a handkerchief. "I was wrong." Ruth Ann Whitaker, seated in the front row, straightened her spine. Her brother-in-law continued speaking, each word seeming to cost him. "My actions, and my silence regarding the actions of others, have caused harm to this community. The incident at Cole's garage," Dale's voice cracked. "My nephew's involvement. It happened because I fostered an environment where such hatred could grow." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ethan felt Grace's hand squeeze his arm gently. "I failed to see that change isn't something to fear," Dale went on. "I failed to recognize that helping our neighbors makes us stronger, not weaker. The food pantry project. I opposed it for all the wrong reasons." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, hand still shaking. "I hereby submit my resignation from the town council, effective immediately. I hope this will allow our community to heal and move forward under better leadership." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Council President Jensen accepted the envelope with a solemn nod. "Additionally," Dale added, his voice stronger now, "I am donating my commercial properties downtown to Neighbors Table to be used as they see fit for community service." Grace drew in a sharp breath. Ethan's eyes widened. Those properties were worth a small fortune. "Before I step down," Dale said, "I would like to nominate Ruth Ann Whitaker to serve as community advisor to the council. Her wisdom and courage in recent weeks have shown me what true leadership looks like." Ruth Ann rose from her seat, smoothing her floral dress. Her eyes glistened, but her voice was clear and steady. "I accept the nomination, with one condition: that we rename the advisory position to Community Bridge Builder, because that's what we need now more than ever." Council President Jensen smiled. "All in favor?" A forest of hands shot up. Even those who hadn't raised their hands nodded in approval. "Motion carries," Jensen announced. "Ruth Ann Whitaker will serve as our first community bridge builder." Dale gathered his belongings slowly, placing his council nameplate in his briefcase. The room watched in respectful silence as he made his way down the center aisle toward the exit. As he passed Ethan's row, their eyes met. Dale paused, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Ethan stood, extending his hand. It was a simple gesture, but in it lay the power of forgiveness, the possibility of redemption. Dale grasped it firmly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. No words were necessary. The handshake said everything that needed to be said. Behind them, Ruth Ann was already at the council table, arranging her papers and straightening her new nameplate. The evening sun caught the engraving. Ruth Ann Whitaker, Community Bridge, Builder, making the letters shine like a promise of better days ahead. The autumn morning dawned crisp and bright as sunlight glinted off the freshly painted red brick of the old firehouse. Bright balloons in yellow and blue, the colors of neighbors' table, danced in the breeze, tied to every lamppost along Maple Street. The brass band from Maple Hollow High School warmed up their instruments in the parking lot, their music floating through the air like a celebration. Ethan Cole stood at the entrance, adjusting his new navy polo shirt with the neighbors' table logo. The shirt still felt strange, a symbol of his new role as fleet and facilities lead, but the pride in wearing it was undeniable. He watched as Ruth Ann directed volunteers, carrying steaming casserole dishes into the converted kitchen space. "Dad!" Micah called out, running up with an armful of paper programs. "Look what Grace helped me make!" The programs featured a child's drawing of the old firehouse, now transformed into the new home of Neighbor's Table, with the words, "Welcome to our table," written in careful letters. "Those are perfect, buddy," Ethan said, ruffling his son's hair. The boy beamed and hurried off to hand them out to the growing crowd. Inside, the transformation was remarkable. The old fire engine bays now housed neat rows of shelving, their metal gleaming in the morning light, streaming through the tall windows. Where fire trucks once stood ready to battle flames, food now waited to fight hunger. The original brass pole had been preserved, wrapped in twinkling lights that made it look like a beacon of hope. Grace moved through the space, directing volunteers with gentle efficiency. She paused beside Ethan, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "As we'll ever be," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. The band struck up "When the Saints Go Marching In" as Mayor Jensen cut the ribbon stretched across the entrance. Applause erupted from the crowd, and the first families began to enter, guided by volunteers wearing yellow aprons. Ethan watched as Ruth Ann greeted each person by name, her choir director's memory for faces serving a new purpose now. She directed them to shopping carts, donated by the grocery store, and painted in cheerful colors by local schoolchildren. The old dispatch office had become a play area where children could wait while their parents shopped. Micah was there now, showing younger kids how to color pictures of fruits and vegetables. The walls were lined with their artwork, turning the space into a gallery of hope and creativity. Reverend Price stood near the fresh produce section, blessing each family that passed with a gentle word and sometimes a prayer. The elderly pastor's eyes were wet with happy tears as he watched the community come together. In what had once been the firefighters' kitchen, volunteers served hot meals at cafe-style tables. The smell of Ruth Ann's famous chicken and dumplings mixed with fresh coffee and warm bread. The sound of conversation and laughter filled the air. Not the awkward silence of a charity line, but the warm buzz of neighbors sharing a meal. Janelle Brooks, the code officer, walked through with her clipboard, but this time her inspection was just a formality. She stopped to accept a cup of coffee and actually smiled when Micah offered her a homemade cookie. Near the loading dock, the good wagon gleamed in the sunlight, freshly washed and ready for its expanded mission. Ethan had personally overseen its restoration, and now it would carry food not just around Maple Hollow, but to neighboring towns as well. 2 more vans were already being fitted out in the workshop space he'd set up in the back of the building. A young mother approached the checkout area, looking nervous. Grace stepped forward to help her, speaking softly in Spanish. The woman's shoulders relaxed as Grace explained how the point system worked, designed to give people choices and dignity in their selections. Ethan moved through the space, checking that everything ran smoothly. He paused to fix a wobbly shelf, adjust a sign, help an elderly man carry his bags. These small acts of service felt as natural as breathing now. This wasn't just a job, it was a calling. The morning flew by in a blur of activity. By early afternoon, The initial rush had settled into a steady flow. Ethan stood in the doorway of his new workshop, watching volunteers load the goods wagon for its first delivery run to the senior center in the next town over. The van's engine purred to life. He'd made sure of that himself. As it pulled out of the parking lot, Ethan felt something settle in his chest. This wasn't just about fixing engines anymore. It wasn't even just about feeding people. It was about building something larger than himself, something that would last. Grace appeared beside him, clipboard still in hand. "The first day's numbers are amazing," she said. "We've helped twice as many families as we did at the garage." Ethan nodded, watching the goods wagon disappear around the corner. In its wake, he could see the future clearly. Not just one van, but a fleet of them. Not just one town, but a whole region working together. His purpose wasn't limited to the walls of a garage anymore. It had grown, like a seed breaking through concrete, reaching for the light. The autumn morning dawned crisp and bright as sunlight glinted off the freshly painted red brick of the old firehouse. Bright balloons, in yellow and blue, the colors of neighbors' table, danced in the breeze, tied to every lamppost along Maple Street. The brass band from Maple Hollow High School warmed up their instruments in the parking lot, their music floating through the air like a celebration. Ethan Cole stood at the entrance, adjusting his new navy polo shirt with the neighbor's table logo. The shirt still felt strange, a symbol of his new role as fleet and facilities lead. But the pride in wearing it was undeniable. He watched as Ruth Ann directed volunteers who carried trays of her famous apple pies to tables set up along the sidewalk. "Places, everyone," Ruth Ann called out, clapping her hands. "The parade starts in 5 minutes." Down at the corner of Main and Maple, veterans gathered in their pressed uniforms, flags ready. Mr. Jenkins, who'd fought in Vietnam, straightened his cap and nodded at Ethan. Behind them, the goods wagon gleamed in the morning light, its fresh paint job making it look brand new. Micah sat perched on the passenger seat, wearing a miniature version of Ethan's polo shirt and waving to everyone who passed by. The band struck up "God Bless America," and the parade began to move. The veterans stepped forward in perfect formation, their flags catching the breeze. Behind them came Grace Alvarez, walking beside Reverend Price, both carrying baskets filled with fresh red apples. Children from the elementary school marched behind them, each wearing paper chef's hats they'd made in art class. They reached into wagons, pulled by their parents, and tossed apples to the crowd lining the streets. The fruit rolled and bounced along the curb, bringing smiles to every face as people bent to retrieve them. "Look, Dad," Micah called from the goods wagon as it rolled past. "We're sharing food with everybody." Ethan's heart swelled at his son's words. Just months ago, they'd barely had enough soup to fill their own bowls. Now here they were, part of something bigger than themselves. The combined choirs of 3 local churches walked behind the wagon, their voices rising in harmony. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The hymn floated over the crowd, and people joined in, creating a symphony of hope that seemed to touch the very sky. Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the Mexican restaurant down the street, walked with a group of women carrying traditional dishes they'd prepared for the celebration. The smell of tamales and fresh bread mingled with the autumn air. Behind them came Mr. Chen from the Asian market, his family helping him push a cart loaded with mooncakes and fresh fruit. The parade wound its way through downtown, past the spot where Ethan's garage had once stood. But today, no one looked at the empty lot with sadness. Instead, all eyes were on the converted firehouse ahead, its giant doors thrown wide open in welcome. Janelle Brooks, the code enforcement officer, stood near the entrance in her official uniform. But today she wore a volunteer's apron over it, and her usual stern expression had softened into a genuine smile. She gave Ethan a quiet nod as the parade approached. The goods wagon came to a stop right in front of the building, and Micah hopped down, running to his father's side. Grace stepped forward, holding a large pair of scissors tied with a blue ribbon. She handed them to Micah, who looked up at his father with shining eyes. "Together?" Grace asked them both. Ethan placed his hand over his son's on the scissors, and together they cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The band played a triumphant march as people began streaming into the new facility. Inside, the transformation was remarkable. The old fire pole had been polished to a shine, and around it wound a spiral staircase leading to the education center upstairs. Where fire trucks once parked, neat rows of shelves held fresh produce and staples. The old lockers had been repainted in cheerful colors and now stored dry goods. Even the dispatch office had been converted into a welcome center, complete with comfortable chairs and children's books. Ruth Ann's choir positioned themselves near the old brass fire bell, which now served as a symbol of community. They began to sing, "Blessed be the tie that binds," their voices filling the space with joy. Dale's nephew, working his community service hours, quietly stocked shelves alongside other volunteers. When he caught Ethan's eye, he gave a small, grateful nod. The shame of his actions had been transformed into a chance for redemption, just as the old firehouse had been transformed into a place of hope. Ethan watched as Micah approached a nervous-looking classmate who stood with his mother near the entrance. His son reached into a box and pulled out a paper bag filled with apples, bread, and fresh vegetables. With a smile that could light up the darkest night, Micah held out the bag and said, "We have food. Want to help us share?" The choir's voices swelled with amazing grace, once again as Ethan looked around at the faces that had made this miracle possible. Grace stood by the welcome desk, her father's legacy of discrimination now fully transformed into a legacy of love. Ruth Ann arranged flowers on a table, her determined spirit having helped push through every obstacle. Reverend Price blessed each person who entered, his gentle wisdom having guided them all through the darkest days. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as the parade wound down. Streamers and confetti dotted the sidewalks like colorful autumn leaves, and the lingering scent of fresh-baked bread from the firehouse kitchen wrapped the crowd in warmth. Children darted between adults' legs, their pockets stuffed with the apples they'd caught during the parade. Ethan Cole stood at the entrance of the renovated firehouse, his weathered hands resting on Micah's shoulders. The 9-year-old boy's eyes sparkled with pride as he watched volunteers organizing the remaining food bags on tables that stretched the length of the old engine bay. Through the open doors, Ethan spotted Tommy Martinez, one of Micah's classmates, hanging back near the street. The boy's worn sneakers shuffled in place, his eyes darting between the food-laden tables and the ground. Ethan had seen that look before, the same one he'd worn not so long ago. Pride, wrestling with need. "Micah," Ethan whispered, nodding toward Tommy. "I think someone could use a friend right now." His son's face lit up with understanding. Micah grabbed one of the prepared food bags and walked over to his classmate with the easy grace of childhood. Tommy's shoulders tensed as Micah approached, but he didn't back away. "We have food," Micah said, holding out the bag. Then, with a gentle smile that reminded Ethan so much of Grace's way with people, he added, "Want to help us share?" Tommy's eyes widened, confusion replacing anxiety. "Share? Yeah, we need more helpers to hand out bags. You can stand next to me." Micah gestured toward the tables where Grace Alvarez was directing traffic with her characteristic calm efficiency. A small smile crept across Tommy's face as he accepted both the bag and the invitation. Ethan watched the two boys head inside together, Micah already chattering about which tables needed restocking. The sight brought a lump to Ethan's throat. Just months ago, he'd been watering down soup in his garage, too proud to admit he needed help. Now here was his son, turning charity into friendship with the same simple grace that had transformed their entire town. Ruth Ann Whitaker appeared at his side, her choir robe swishing as she walked. "That boy of yours," she said, shaking her head with a smile. "He's got a gift for healing hearts." "He does at that," Ethan agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Seems to run in the neighborhood these days." Inside the firehouse, the space that had once housed fire engines now buzzed with activity. The old dispatch office had become a welcoming area where families could sit and chat while waiting their turn. Children's artwork decorated the walls, drawings of food, cars, and people holding hands in circles. Micah's original "We Fix Cars Fill Carts" sign held a place of honor above the main entrance. Reverend Harlan Price stood near the kitchen, his presence as steady as ever. He caught Ethan's eye and nodded, both men remembering their conversation about hunger and hope on that porch so many nights ago. The renovated kitchen gleamed with industrial efficiency, but it was the warmth of home that filled the space. Volunteers moved about with practiced ease, some packaging fresh vegetables while others organized dry goods. The nephew who had once tried to burn down their dream now worked alongside them, his community service becoming genuine service to the community. Grace appeared at Ethan's side, clipboard in hand but eyes on the scene before them. "Look at what you helped build, Ethan," she said softly. "What we all built," he corrected her, watching as Micah showed Tommy how to properly stack the canned goods. Every single person in this room had a part in it. From outside came the sound of Ruth Ann gathering her choir. Their voices rose in the opening notes of "Amazing Grace," the hymn that had become their unofficial anthem. The music floated through the open doors, wrapping around the bustling activity like a warm embrace. Micah ran back to his father, Tommy following close behind. Both boys' faces shone with the satisfaction of work well done. Ethan knelt down and pulled his son into a tight hug, overwhelmed by how far they'd come from that morning when Micah had innocently asked why they had no food. The choir's voices swelled, filling Maple Street with harmony. Around them, the community they'd helped rebuild continued its work, passing out food, sharing stories, healing old wounds. Through the windows, Ethan could see the good wagon parked proudly outside, ready for its next delivery run to neighboring towns. He held his son close, breathing in the moment. This wasn't just about fixing what was broken anymore. It was about creating something entirely new, something better than what had been before. "This town's not just fixed," Ethan whispered into Micah's hair. "It's renewed." As if in answer, the bells of First Methodist began to ring across Maple Hollow, their clear tones joining with the voices of the choir in joyful celebration. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan Cole, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.